Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Maintaining Authorial Authenticity in a Commercial Market. And joining me on the show to cover this topic is an author I've known for a while from school, and now she's joining me on the show. Please welcome Riley Kilmore. Hey, Riley.
Hey, how you doing, Demi?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. It's so excellent to connect with you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for reaching out about being on the show. I'm delighted to have you. We have a fantastic conversation planned, but before we get into that, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey as an author so far.
Alrighty, I'll do that. So again, I am Riley Kilmore, and I'm the author of the middle grade fantasy adventure Shay the Brave. So that's a book I like to say was written for readers from age 6 to 96 because it's a middle grade book, but I've had adults read it who have enjoyed it as well. Shay is actually a retelling of sorts. It's inspired by one of the Aesop's fables, Androcles and the Lion. And it features a queer protagonist and her differently abled sidekick, Alexi. He is mute and communicates mostly through sign language. So, Shay the Brave features a number of themes that I think speak to today's world. And those are like the value of intercultural friendship, the courage to be your authentic self, the benefits of a STEM education, the morality of vegetarianism, and what I guess I'd call sort of an own voices approach in the current literary world. Excuse me. So own voices. It's really just another way of saying staying in your lane when you're writing. So, and I mean by that, not that all writers have to always make everything autobiographical, but it's kind of another way in my mind of rephrasing that old adage, write what you know. So the way I stayed in my lane in this particular book was several fold, and if we have time, I'll quickly touch upon those as a way of introducing myself more now that I've introduced my book. So, well, okay, so one way I've described myself while I was growing up was as someone who didn't feel comfortable in their own skirts. And in my early years, I didn't have a choice about that. I had to wear dresses. So almost from page one, we discover in Shay the Brave that she's that same way as well. So now Shay the Brave isn't set on Earth, even though to a large extent it reflects a pre-industrial society that's sort of medieval-esque in nature. And in her world, just like in ours, cultural norms are dictating what individuals are allowed and not allowed to wear, or what they are allowed or not allowed to do. So I personally grew up wrestling with those sorts of restraints. Years ago on the playground, it was the boys that I would play with, and it wasn't a Jackson hopscotch kind of kid. I was a mud on my knees, tree climbing, explore construction sites kind of kid. And as an adult, I ended up entering into a world that, at least at the time, wasn't seen. I worked in fields that weren't considered women's work, which is less true today. But in when I broke into the workforce, I was the first to do a lot of that kind of thing in my region. So, like for instance, in college, I had a job driving a forklift. After college, I became the first woman firefighter in my town and the first woman police officer in the township where I was hired. And I was the first woman to join the JCs in my town. That was an organization that was formerly not open to women. And back when I became a wildland firefighter out west, I was always the only woman both on my crew and in my camp. So I've always been one to sort of push against that glass ceiling, but it was never really something I wanted to do to prove something to anyone about the strength of women. It was just like in every case, I was simply pursuing the things that I, as an individual, were deeply interested in. But because of my outward appearance and presumed gender and all that, I would always have to fight for the right to pursue the things I wanted to pursue, where other people could do that without question. So Shay, my protagonist, is this way, and her culture places limits on her attire and her pursuits and her hair so that she has to struggle against these restraints. But again, she's not doing it to make trouble for anyone. She's just trying to be her authentic self. And by the end of the book, she does make a transition in some regards. And another way that Shade the Brave is a story that's sort of from my own lane is seen through the character Alexi, and he's the sidekick character who is mute, and he's also the laundress's son. So Shay not only reaches across cultural and gender barriers, she reaches across classist barriers too. She's the manor lord's daughter, and her buddy is sort of a barefoot boy without pedigree there. Um, Anyway, Alexi communicates primarily through sign language, and that character origin story lies in two of my sons who, as toddlers, were not developing speech, each for a totally different reason. Both were born prematurely, and later one suffered from severe lead poisoning, and the other, excuse me, who was born with some severe cardiac anomalies, ended up suffering a cerebral hemorrhage when he was overdosed in the hospital with an anticoagulant called urokinase. Anyway, both of them ended up attending special preschools that were run by the Easter Seal Society, and both initially were learning rudimentary sign language in order to make their needs and their wants known. So their dad and I, of course, had to be learning right along with them. And eventually both did develop speech, and they're now, passionate, articulate, self-supporting adults with college degrees. But in those early years, the future lay darkly before us on a number of fronts. And those sorts of things, those sorts of challenges stay with parents, and they sort of become part of the marrow in your bones. So having had to focus on that nonverbal kind of communication with two of my kids early in their lives absolutely informed my creation of the Alexi character. Um, so before I finish, just let me add one or two more things. I just wanted to also mention to your audience that um, I'm really excited to announce that the next installment in the Shay universe is forthcoming very soon. It's a companion journal to Shay the Brave, and it's called Share with Shay. It was the brainchild of my publisher, Wild Ink Publishing, which, by the way, is a woman owned indie publisher located right here in South Central Pennsylvania, where I also live. And that journal is going to be filled with terrific prompts that I wrote to help kids jumpstart their own creative thinking processes and to do a little deep thinking of their own, just like Shay does in Shay the Brave. And I don't have a release date for that yet, but it's going to be coming pretty fast. And then the other thing I'm working on, there is a sequel to Shay the Brave in the pipeline, and I am looking forward to be able to, saying a little more about that in the future. So if people just want to keep an eye on my website, they can follow for updates there.
Wow, what a fabulous introduction. You are already awesome. So much great information from you there. You are definitely a perfect author to touch on authenticity because you definitely pulled on many personal experiences and certain experiences you've been through and that people you know have been through to create your characters in an authentic way that represents those different diverse backgrounds authentically, which is super, super important. And one thing you said toward the beginning that I love so much is that Shay the Brave is middle grade, but it can appeal to a very, very wide range of readers. And I love that because books like this one, they have these universal themes. And even though it's a fantasy world, they have themes that can connect to people no matter how old they are, no matter where they live in the world. And I think this is a really great example of no matter if you're writing fiction, middle grade, set in fantasy world, whatever, we include these qualities in our stories rooted in personal and authentic experiences in order to create reader connection.
Yeah, I think everything you say makes total sense. It's and very well put to me. Absolutely, yeah.
Fabulous. So, transitioning into our chat specifically, you touched on this a little bit, but just to go deeper, how would you define being authentic as an author?
I mean, at least to my way of thinking, it ties back into, that write what you know. So you draw upon your own experiences, but again, that doesn't mean, your characters have to. I mean, you can write a novel about space travel and certainly have never been to space, right? So that's not what it means. But your characterizations will be stronger and more appealing, I think, if they're drawn from your own life story. So people you've known or things you've done. If you can draw on that, I just think it's going to strengthen your character to the point where people are going to be able to relate to it better. I mean, it's going to be very subconscious on a lot of levels, right? Um, but as you're writing, you're drawing on those familiar experiences and individuals, and it's just going to feed into your character and make them more believable.
Mhm. Absolutely. I love how you mentioned that it happens on a subconscious level because I have had many instances of working on drafts for novels. And then once I started the revision process, I would see little pieces of myself in my characters that I didn't
Ah,
intentionally put in. And I
oh
think that's
yeah.
the cool thing about when you're approaching it authentically, if you're not thinking too hard about, oh, I have to do this for a certain market reason, or I have to do this because even though this isn't authentic to me, it'd be better for the story. Like if you overthink things and you make choices for reasons other than what is genuine to you, then you can hit a few walls, I think. But when you're just writing naturally and writing what's coming to you, those subconscious moments will come up without you knowing. And it definitely was really cool for me to look back and see, okay, yeah, this character, she's really like me in this instance, and this character is like me in this instance. But they're completely different people. They're not me at all. There's just these little qualities that I share and challenges that I've been through that are reflected in my characters.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes, I think about it like my undergraduate degree is in theater. So sometimes I think about writing as its connection to theater. And so it's sort of like using the method of acting, putting yourself in that character and drawing upon your own experiences, even though on stage you're saying someone else's lines and they might not be something you've done as an individual, but you're feeding like your emotional story into it. And I think that happens with writing too. um, I think you just the deeper you can place yourself in that character's point of view, um, the more of that's going to filter through. And again, like you said, like on an unconscious level, yeah, I think it definitely will.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's a perfect comparison. And I think what you exactly said there about putting yourself in their deep point of view. If you're acting and you're playing a role, you need to know that character in order to portray them. And the same goes for when we're writing. If we're writing a character, we need to know them very well. We need to know their darkest fears and their biggest dreams and their biggest flaws and what makes them self conscious about themselves and what do they want most in life, what's holding them back. There are all these things that we need to understand in order to show that. And the cool thing is, when you know your character super well, those things will naturally come out. I think there are some books, especially when I'm editing through Amethyst Ink, if there isn't a deep point of view, I don't feel like I know the character as a reader that well. I don't feel like I can fully connect to them. And I think the really cool thing is as long as you are maintaining that deep point of view. Even if I'm reading a character that is polar opposite from me, I'm still able to connect because I feel like I'm in their shoes and I see the world through their eyes and I'm experiencing their experiences. And so, as long as you're maintaining a deep point of view and showing that character to the reader authentically and vividly, then even if the reader doesn't fully represent them in their real life, they can still connect because of how they're portrayed.
It's so true to me. And it's interesting when you mentioned about like learning sort of how to bring forth a deeper point of view. Like that's one thing I actually learned a lot from my MFA. And again, we're co-graduates of the same program. And I often think of that is that one thing I really garnered from that education was how to improve point of view and deepen it. It's interesting because my theater degrees from the same school. So I learned how to step into character first through acting at Seton Hill, and then I learned how to step into character more deeply through writing from Seton Hill. So yeah, it's an interesting thing, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And interiority is so important. That's where the magic happens. That's where the character and reader bond happens for sure. And another point
Absolutely.
I wanted to mention in terms of writing authentically is a little more general in terms of what you're writing. So when I sit down to write a story, I'm thinking about, what is authentic for me to write, what genre, what age category, what trope. There are sometimes in the market, especially like, for example, right now, like vampire books are like kind of becoming hot again. Well, I personally can't really see myself writing a vampire book. It just doesn't really fit me as a person. And so I would be going against my authentic self if I wrote something just because it's getting super trendy. So that's an example of authenticity as well. If you are like a romance girly forever and ever, then like write your romance novels. Don't turn around and write a horror novel just because maybe all your friends are doing it or whatever. So it also comes down to writing the kinds of books that you feel drawn to write.
Yeah, yeah, and again, when you're drawn to it, you're likely to bring strengths to it. If it won't be artificial. Like you're not like trying to just reach market trends. But there's nothing wrong with like if you are writing something, trying to stay abreast a little bit of market trends, or just again, we talked about marketability, which is different than market trends, which is really more key. Is just trying to maintain in your mind the marketability of what you're doing, and again, a lot of times that'll come into play once you've gotten your book written and it's in the hands of an editor, because then the editor will have their you know finger on the pulse of the marketing situation better than you might. So that's the point when things really sort of come together. You got to start making some changes in your manuscript to meet with the editor's vision as far as what's going to best market that book. So so that gets really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think as I've been writing more and more, I'm starting to understand more how to write with marketability in mind. Before I was just writing stories I wanted to write, and it's always so important, as we've been talking about with authenticity, to write stories that are authentic to you and that you want to write. But on the other side of this situation, if you want to pursue publishing, there is a business side to that, and so I've been
Right.
more mindful as well as I'm working on my manuscripts, thinking, okay, this is my idea, this is my authentic decision of what I want to write about, but how can I write this with word count expectations in mind? How can I write this with commercial appeal in mind? And so you're making more decisions in order to get that book to be marketable, in order to get it to sell, because that's the whole point. We want our books to sell. And so I think once you start getting deeper into publishing, you start to see these little dances between, okay, this is what I want to say, but this is what the business kind of requires, and you try to find a balance within that.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you think you're doing something that's very marketable, um, and and you just kind of plow forward with it, and then it gets into the hands of an editor, and they can often point something out to you that you hadn't any way of really recognizing as possibly being problematic. So yeah, it becomes important then sort of to find that collaboration and that cooperative point between you and your editor, where to change things, and still maintain what you feel is your authentic voice. Like you don't want to let your story be changed so much that it's no longer your story. But you also have to recognize that there are like a team of people who bring to the table information and knowledge that you might not have, and so trying to compromise and listening to some of their suggestions and changing things, even as what might seem picayune as like word choice, um, can matter uh, in a given market, or just it's just so hard to say. And so I think it's really important to try and be open to some of those changes, as hard as they can be. I mean, well, to kind of explain, I'll give you one example from my own experience, and that was so in Shay the Brave. I have a character that's now known as Nona Kolish, and she's sort of a grandmotherly individual who is like an herbalist who makes teas and helps heal, keep people healthy, whatever. Because this is a pre-industrial society. But originally, like I had the character, I didn't have a name for the character, and they were more nebulous, and they were not well fleshed out. and they were called. I had them called the Potion Keeper, and it's just like a title. That's all I had. And my editor didn't like that. So my editor didn't like the the whole potion thing. Um, she didn't think that fit, and that if she hadn't like talked to me about that and pointed that out, I would never have fleshed out the character more and found another avenue to go that sort of I think fits better in the long run with the whole story. Um, so little things like that, just you know, a word here or there that the editor might say, I don't think we want to use this word. Let's find another way around it. Another example was like I had again because it's sort of a medieval-esque story. I had the characters drinking mead, um, and there is actually non-alcoholic mead, but she said you can't have alcohol in a middle grade book.
Makes sense.
And to me, it was like, oh, okay. Well, I didn't think of it as alcoholic or that other people would automatically associate it with
Right.
alcohol.
Yeah.
So to me, it was more like like setting the time frame and the setting by what they drank and stuff. So I had to come up with something else for like that. So these are the things where like you don't know what the marketability is in some of these smaller ways. You just got to write your story, and then when someone on your team points out these things to you, it's like a challenge. You got to come up with a way around it, and usually what you come up with ends up being better than what you had in the first place.
Yeah. No, a lot of great examples and points too. I think there definitely is a balance between maintaining your story's voice and the story you want to tell, but then compromising in these other areas for marketability purposes. I've definitely had same experiences where whenever I would get like edits back, if there are certain things that I know changing it would just completely bring down like my vision for the story and the story I wanted to tell. Like I was a little more hesitant for those changes because it completely shifted the story. But there are other, things that I was suggested to do that I was like, yeah, you know what, like that makes total sense. And I love getting feedback. I'm really receptive to it. I apply it as much as I possibly can, unless it completely just goes against something I believe for the story. And that's the thing too, like as authors, like we need to, tell the story we want to tell, but also make it marketable. So I think it does take some, I don't know, like we as authors should have the ability to know what we want and be able to advocate for certain things in our books, which is good. And just so we're not like taking every bit of feedback, because sometimes especially if you're in like the beta reading or critiquing stage, sometimes if you get a lot of people's advice, it will contradict each other. And sometimes some pieces of advice just don't fit with the story. And I think it takes a like skill to be able to look at feedback and be like, yeah, this makes sense for the story, this doesn't. And so that's a really good skill to have as an author. But in terms of making changes that are necessary, you're exactly right. Like these little tiny details that you never would have thought of because they're tiny, right? Like they're not like these big dramatic plot point major changes are these really tiny word choice things, tiny details that could be perceived of something that they're not. And so I definitely think that there's a balance between maintaining your story's voice and then, like you said, also making these changes to fit the marketability. And you're exactly right. Like there were so many moments where maybe I was super hesitant to make a certain change. And then after I did it, I was like, oh my God, it's like so much better now because I made this change. And so sometimes you just have to like trust what people are telling you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was the same way, like, what? Like I have to do what, and then again, I tried to look at it like a challenge and think, well, how can I do that and still like not lose what I feel like is my authentic input to the story.
Right. Yeah.
And and usually it worked out better. And then I mean there were honestly a couple of things where it was like it would have changed this the gist of the story or something too critical, and I had to push back on the pushback. Like I had to say like no, this has to stay. And because I knew there were certain things I could not yield, as far as I could with other things I yielded because
Right.
I wanted to meet people halfway.
Right, right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I tried to only like stick to my guns where it was like it felt like the crux of the story would be changed if
Right,
I gave
exactly.
ground there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you know what? There's also like a whole nother thing I didn't think about entering into, like the marketability. Now this is more of a, I guess you would call it an accessibility issue, but one thing I didn't wasn't aware of. Now, like, okay, so as I said in my introduction, Alexei speaks through sign language, and the way I originally had that in the manuscript was I italicized his communication. So, like, Shay might say something, of course it's in quotes, blah blah blah, Shay said, right? And then he would sign, and you'd know he's signing, because it was italics or whatever. But I was told then that, like, when it came time for revisions and edits, it was like, well, we cannot have italics in a middle grade book because it has to do with, like, it is a readership problem for, like, dyslexic people,
Yeah, I
or
did hear about this. Yeah, I learned about this whenever we did Clio through outing.
oh,
That's the first
okay.
I heard about it, and it was, like, so interesting to me because I had no idea that that was part of why we left italics out. So that was really fascinating to learn.
Right. So I had to do, like, a lot of work around and rewriting for that. Yeah, but the thing is, I didn't. We were able to compromise again because I had a lot of italics. So I basically we cut them down to half, um, and I got rid of them. I think everywhere where he was communicating, but they were there for other reasons. And then they also found a workaround by selecting a specific font for the publication of the book, wherein the italics version of that font is not a problem. And I think it has something to do with, like, the serif and sans serif or whatever fonts,
Okay.
but they did find a workaround. So there are some italics in Shay. People will see, like, hey, she said there's no italic, but it's not that there's none. It's just that there's super less than there was before.
Yeah.
So you know what I mean. So yeah. So there's often things that crop up to make something more marketable that, as the writer, you might not know, and it's just really great to try and sort of take a deep breath and think about the reasons behind the changes that are being asked of you.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Yeah.
justifications are really important, and that's the thing, like, every time I make a change, I do so because the person giving me the advice, there's justification, there's reason, and when I sit down and think about it, it makes total sense. The feedback that I struggle with sometimes is if it's a little more like, personal preference, like if a critique partner is saying, "Oh, I would prefer it this way," but there's not necessarily anything wrong with how it is now. If it's more of a
Mm,
subjectivity thing, I think that's different. But whenever
right.
there's like, authentic justification for why certain change should happen, I think it's a little easier to make the changes to make it more marketable. Well, Riley, this has been a joy, and we're getting down to the end of our chat, which is ridiculous because this went really fast.
No.
But just to wrap things up, what are some final thoughts you have about maintaining authorial authenticity, that's hard to say, in a commercial market?
Well, again, I think you have to start out with a really strong sense of a voice and point of view. I think if you start out with that, and that's sort of built into what you're turning over to, excuse me, to, like, an editor, you're starting from a position of strength. And um, and then when they come at you and say, well, we need to change this and alter this and do that, um, keep in mind again that their goal is to sell the book just like your goal is. And at times it might feel like you're at odds with the vision. So you compromise every place you possibly can, but you hold on to those core things that you feel make your story your story. So it is, probably the key words for today's chat would be, like, collaboration and compromise, because that's what I see as the intersection of authentic, authorial voice. Is that what we're saying? And the need to make things marketable.
Mhm.
So
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. This has been a true delight, and this brings us to the plot twist. Are you ready?
no, but I'm very curious. So go ahead.
What is one book you remember as a child that made you first fall in love with reading?
Oh, what a wonderful question. But oh, Demi, I could go on and on. And oh my gosh, some of my favorite books as a child. Okay, almost all of them inevitably were animal stories. And it's interesting because, of course, there's animals in my story. It's a very big animal story. Bridie of the Grand Canyon, I loved. Um, the books by Dodie Smith, 101 Dalmatians in
Yeah,
their
yeah, yeah, yeah,
original
yeah.
form. I love those. Um, but one of my absolute favorite books as a child was called Rufus Redtail. And it's out of print and very hard to find, and I've looked for it for years. But it was just, it captured my heart, the story of this red-tailed hawk. And it was a coming of age story, really, no less, of this hawk. Uh, but yeah, so animal stories mostly, and sometimes they were animal stories where they were, related to humans, like in my book. But sometimes they were just like Rufus Redtail, where there really weren't any humans in the story. So, yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Can you share with everybody where they can find you online and check out your book?
Yes. Well, probably easiest thing to do is just go check out my website, www.rileykilmore.com, because, there's links to all my other social media on there. But I am on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all under Riley Kilmore. So I'm pretty easy to find. I also write a Substack. So that's also under Riley Kilmore, and there's links to that on my website as well. And people who are familiar with the publisher, Wild Ink Publishing, they also have a page on there for my book, and a little bit about me is on there as well.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much again for joining me on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I just love your show.
Oh, thank you. It was a joy having you. And listeners, that is a wrap on this chapter with Riley, all about maintaining authorial authenticity in a commercial market. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving the podcast a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in publishing you think would enjoy the show, please pass it along to them. Thank you for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.